Okay, so it looks like we are, let me see, make sure we are live on both platforms. Okay, there goes YouTube. And my Facebook always gives me a little resistance, so I can't often tell if it's live.
You're live.
Oh, you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't. All right, so we're just gonna roll with that. Hope everybody is well. Welcome to this week's Onyx Report. I apologize for being a few minutes over, but got a special guest in the building who we are always happy to have on screen. He's always supporting the show in the comment section, but I always love to have him on, especially considering that the brother is a fountain of information, and I don't want people to. I don't understand how people get that twisted. So we about to let BGS come in here and put his foot in this. So I hope everybody is doing well. Shout out to Officer Faulkner. What's up, Damon, Malika? Let's see. We got a number of people in here. Mr. Wusa, Nameless Protagonist, ADOS Narrative, Christopher, what's going on? Muada, what's happening? Oh man, we got a full house tonight, man. Michael Harper.
Hit the like button on your way in, folks. Hit the like button on your way in.
Hit the like button, share, subscribe, please. We're not too far from 10,000 subscribers, so that would be something I would enjoy. But got about 73 watching so far. But definitely a full room. Rashid, what's happening? TRN, right? So we definitely, I think we struck a nerve, most particularly on this subject. But you guys know me. We got a number of things to cover before we get to that. And they're all related. So it's not wholly separate. West Coast, what's going on? Professor Conroe, thank you. Good to see you in here. Let me just get this thing up in here. And we will be good. What's your give me a Cash App, BGS.
Mine?
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Hold on. I gotta look it up myself.
I never know it offhand. Mr. Meach, what's happening? Mr. Marcus, Adam, what's going on? Let's see here. Okay. So you all know the deal. The subject of today's discussion are Black boys still property of the state? A Black masculinist analysis. All right. So we are going to go in a little bit. Oh, you just went ahead and put it in the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to type it in here, but that works too. All right. All right. So please support the channel. This week, as I said, we're going to be, what's up, Marvin? We're going to be going in, obviously, on Black boys and the condition of them. And I got some information that might blow you away if you're not familiar with some of the data. So we'll be getting into that. Next week, we'll be dealing with Black male archetypes. So we'll be talking a little bit about the ways in which we present ourselves. And contrary to how I tend to see it happening on YouTube, I'm not just going to point out some of the things we could do better. I'm going to point out some of the things we've been doing damn good and not being acknowledged on, even by each other. So we're going to get into a little of that, and BGS is going to be my guest this week and next week for that discussion. So
yes, sir.
We're going to have some fun with that, I think. So let's go in a little bit. The way I like to do it, you guys know, I like to start with some current events. We got 110 people watching. So as people come in, I figure we can catch up on some things. Now, some of this I'm showing you this slide and the next one because it relates to me personally. Right now, we're looking at a new record. 2 million acres of California has burned this year, and I am in Central California, if you didn't know, Fresno. So I'm a good 3.5 hours away from LA. I'm a good 3.5 hours away from San Francisco and Oakland. I'm right in the center of the state, and we're having some severe fires. So I want to show you a picture of what Fresno looks like from the sky. So right now, in this image you're seeing here, as orange as everything is, that's how it's been looking the last number of days. If you step out of my door, it looks like this, and all you can smell is ash. But this is what it looks like from the sky in Central California, where I am. All right. So this is what we're dealing with right now. It's crazy out here. It is difficult to breathe. As a matter of fact, hold on. If you look on your iPhone, if you live here and you look up weather, it'll just say the other day it said 100 degrees, and as far as the weather, it just said smoke. Right. Okay. So this is what we're looking at. Yeah. So this is all the trees burning. And much of it coming into Fresno County is still unchecked. 0% containment for a good portion of it. So it's a little wild. They've been clearing out the mountains. Rashid, Mr. Meach, appreciate the Cash App support. They've been clearing out the mountains and evacuating. So I have family member of friends, family members that are being evacuated out of those areas. It's getting crazy, but this is what we're looking at. Okay. But anyway, so just kind of wanted to start with that because that's what we're dealing with right now. But as I go through these current events, I'm going to enjoy having my brother comment on some of these, and some of these are just going to be a straight handoff for the touchdown to brother BGS, and he'll know it when he sees them. So this one I thought was a good report, a good piece on WashingtonPost.com. And by good, I just mean useful information. If you're not aware, near birthplace of Martin Luther King, a predominantly Black nursing home tries to heal after outbreak. And basically what this article talks about is how many Black nursing homes are losing people behind COVID. Mm-hmm. And the impact of that. Had you had a chance to see this particular article?
I haven't seen this one, but I've seen economists. I think it was EPI was talking about the articles about not the people's club, but especially Black people, how the medical establishment actually ignored them, actually increased the death rate of COVID by not getting the proper care. So I'm not surprised about this.
Right. And this is what we're looking at. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the article, definitely check it out. Because again, when we look at any kind of natural disaster, if you have a group of people that haven't been subsidized, even to the degree that they should be as citizens, these kind of things can end up having an adverse impact on them. And this is definitely one way we see it.
The most vulnerable.
And the most vulnerable. Okay. Was there something you were about to add? Okay. All right. So next one up. Vulture capitalism. Ahmaud Arbery's mom accuses organizations and social media pages of profiting off of her son's death. This is off Atlanta Black Star. Interesting because at the end of the day, this is what brothers have been saying, particularly in YouTube, for the last number of years, in terms of how Black males have been treated and perceived to be really cash cows. My boy Green Gorilla commented on this a few days ago on my Facebook page. But he one of the things he talked about was the ways in which this ends up being a lottery for people.
Yeah, it does, and also not only financially but also politically.
Absolutely,
they use these Black men's bodies as stepping stones.
I've seen people advance into politics. I've seen people advance into local activism, and I'm happy about the activism. But when it's done in a way that doesn't end up supporting Black males, especially in regard to how their own children died, how their own family members died, or whoever they advocated for to get into those positions, it doesn't make any sense. Um, let me see. This piece here, HuffingtonPost.com, Michelle Obama on the challenges she faced in marriage to Barack Obama. I brought this up in a video I did in honor of Chadwick Boseman, because this was the piece where she was trying to give advice about marriage and commented on how there were times she wanted to push her husband out of a window.
Right.
Please tell us, what is the problem with such a statement, Brother BGS?
Basically, for whatever reason, Black women do not think about their husband's legacy. And every time you mention something like this, that Michelle Obama, this is not the first time she said something like this. She's been saying something like this since he was running the first time, when she talks about how he used to leave his socks on the floor, as a wife had to pick up behind him. And this is before he became president. But the thing is, this is just typical. But you never hear most first ladies actually trying to tarnish the legacy of their husbands, whether it's in marriage or anything else.
Well, and I would go so far as to say she probably thinks that this is, that what she said is not only positive in general, but positive even in regard to Barack. I don't think she even conceptualizes this as disrespectful.
No.
I mean, and that's one of the things that really intrigued me about this, because I grew up listening to this, in family, amongst friends, amongst, in the environments that I've socialized in, even in schools. I grew up hearing this kind of talk as part of that kind of casual Black women's culture, where what I call that low boiling misandry is part of the language.
That's why she's so beloved by Black women.
Absolutely.
It's because they say she's a real sister.
Exactly. And the belittling of him marks her as such.
As such. Yep, exactly.
So go ahead.
Like I said, you would think that at a certain level you wouldn't hear it, but the thing is, it proves that no matter. I actually used a couple of her takes about her being married to Barack, and showing how no matter what level the man is, that a sister still sees Black men the same way.
Sure. I mean, look, as many problems as I've had with Barack, particularly in regard to the impact of his policies on Black wealth. I have a number of problems with Barack, but at the end of the day, this is still a Black man who's achieved a level that no other has, and yet he's still discussed as if he's something to be tolerated, something, you know what I mean? And so what it really highlights for Black men is that no matter how far you get, this kind of low boiling misandry is still considered acceptable.
Yeah,
there's no way out of it.
He's just a Black man. It doesn't matter what he's achieved.
Right. It doesn't matter what he's achieved. Okay. So this was one you and I had talked about before, but I don't think I covered it in the last show, because I covered a lot of different articles. But this one I thought was interesting. Evicted Loyola law student allegedly threatened landlord before New Orleans apartment fire.
Right.
This was a young Black woman, and the landlord was a Black woman. And there was a number of things that happened here, but she basically couldn't pay her rent for an extended period of time. Right. We talked about August as being the eviction landslide month.
Right.
And I think she got caught in that. So she began to threaten the landlord and her children.
Yes.
And when she was finally evicted, she set her apartment on fire. And it ended up, I think it took the whole building, the whole apartment.
The whole building, all 26 units. Yeah.
All 26 units.
Yeah. And they said they said that as she was leaving for the last time, like 5 minutes after she left, you can see the blaze start to grow.
So whole families out on the street.
Yeah, and 26 families actually. Yeah. Out on the street. Yeah, because there was 26 unit apartment and burned down the whole apartment building. So it has all these people out on the street. And if you listen to her lawyer and her, they try to make her out as a victim. As she was a poor thing. She's a law student. They were putting her out on the street and she just lost it. In other words, they're trying to excuse what she did.
Right. Can you imagine if this was a young Black male?
Uh,
Need I go there? Well,
you-
but I highlighted this especially because, again, just like a few other of the posts that we've looked at and will continue to look at that even contribute to tonight's discussion,
Mhm,
this highlights just how crazy things are. And I say that because, look, I know people here in Fresno that
mhm,
are like, "Oh, I'm doing fine. I don't know what all of the stress is about. I'm good. Everything's cool." And I'm like, if you literally look at the images of Fresno from the sky, we're in hell. If you
mhm.
look at the economy of the country, if you look at the state that many people are living in, the unemployment,
Right.
it's amazing how much a few people that are doing well can be oblivious to
Yeah.
what's going on. So I post these kind of pieces to remind folks this is real. This
You
is
know what?
what people are dealing with.
You know what? The thing that I read that kind of bothered me, that she felt justified in doing what she did.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
still, even though she's behind bars, she felt justified.
Hmm.
That the landlord shouldn't have pushed her. The landlord had no right to evict her
Right.
for non-payment
Right.
of rent.
And because she felt that she should have been, she shouldn't have had to pay,
Mm-hmm.
that justified this kind of response
Mm-hmm.
just because of that.
Just because of
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
um, this is an image that an associate of mine
Wow.
linked to me on Facebook. Now, to my understanding, I haven't found any evidence of it, but this was technically, I was told, an image that came out of South Africa.
Mm.
But the interesting thing about it is, on my page, when I posted it, Black men, including myself, of course, began to comment on our experiences here in America. And not only our experiences, because I'm about 45. This happened with my son as well in elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of segregation that we can talk about in South Africa, particularly during the apartheid years, is hardly limited to South Africa, and it's definitely going to relate to what we're going to get into a little later. But you can see the kind of placement and what goes on. Right. So I thought I'd just share this because I think it gives context, and I wouldn't be surprised if brothers in the chat had similar experiences. Um,
That's. I think that's common. The only difference is that the black boys wouldn't have been in the classroom at all. They'd been in their own special education classroom.
yes, sir. And there are levels to this segregation.
There's levels to it.
Uh, so they're lucky to be in the room, but you can see the treatment. And I've seen how the teachers will treat the one or two black boys, and I wish I was exaggerating. The one or two that are allowed to stay in the room,
Mm-hmm.
they still get mistreated. They still get low, graded low for their efforts, and they get hyper penalized for things that I've seen rooms of these kids doing. But nevertheless, I thought I'd share that very quickly because I thought it poignant. And when we get to the latter part of the show, you'll see why. All right. I had to cover this. Y'all know that. Had to. Right. So we've had two incidents of non-black women portraying themselves as black women in the academy. The one on the left is a professor whose work is primarily in Africana studies and Afro women studies, and the one on the right is apparently a graduate student. But we're finding this kind of this treatment of blackness and womanness as something that white women are attempting to profit from.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Any thoughts about this, sir? And shout out to Kalila in the chat. It's good to see you here. But go ahead, brother.
What I'm saying is, the only reason a white woman would pretend to be a black woman is because there's a benefit. It's because there's money there. There's benefits to be had. So a lot of black women that say they're oppressed and they don't get any benefits, that they're being discriminated against. But with a white woman, a white Jewish woman that's middle class, would pretend to be a black woman to get benefits.
Mm.
So there has to be something there. Like, why do you rob a bank? Because that's where the money is. Why would you
Mm.
pretend to be a black woman? Because that's where the money is.
Mm.
So a lot of them saying they're unprotected, they're discriminated against, and all the other things that they say. This is like two times. Well, this is like the third time you see a white woman pretending to be a black woman and getting benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
So there must
Yeah.
be something there.
Must be something to benefit from. And the one thing that I've heard my brothers online commenting on is we never quite see too many people trying to imitate black men.
No,
I wonder why that is.
that is a little bit more dangerous
Well,
than
what do you
people
mean?
realize.
People don't want to get shot
Yeah.
and tackled and treated. Interesting. I don't know
And
why.
the white men that do try it, they only do it for maybe a month or two.
Quick in and out. Yeah.
Quick in and out. He said,
Yeah,
I don't know how you
absolutely.
guys do this.
And I think this is the fallout of intersectionality in many ways, right? The basic idea that blackness in and of itself can be on a sliding scale with other identities, and it's all good. And
Yeah.
I think you kind of open up this avenue for people to start playing with identity, especially when it's in profitable ways, as you point out. So nobody wants to be a black male because it's not profitable in the identity calculus of intersectionality. But being a black female does come with tangible benefits, especially in terms of resources. You guys remember the show from last week when we talked about the kinds of grants and business loans made available to women and black women as categories, but
Yeah.
none were earmarked for black men.
For black men, exactly. Yeah. I think Tareen has put up something in the chat about a story. Did you hear about the black boy in Colorado who got suspended on a virtual class for having a fake gun?
Oh,
and
yeah.
they knew it was fake, didn't inform the parents. They could have got his house shot up because they did send the police to his house.
Come on, man. Tarian, we're going to get to that. We can't miss that one. You jumping the gun, man. But you gave the super chat, so I wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah, you're kicking the chair, Tareen.
The interesting piece that's dealing with some of what you kind of referred to in a slightly different way, but we're looking at how people are dealing with remote learning, and what we're finding is that particularly in low-income areas, you're finding child neglect cases opened up against them for failure to log into virtual classes, even though the whole question of internet access and of course having the proper kind of devices to where they can participate is a huge question, right? So just thought that this was something to consider as we move forward. I'm gonna jump through a few of these. This one here, I just wanted to shout out this young brother here. Y'all know, as often as I can, I like to talk about what I call the sacred black masculine, and that's where you find black males doing things that they are generally not largely acknowledged for, but it tends to be fairly humane. And in this particular instance, you're talking about a young man named Tamar Boggs who chased a car on his bike for 15 minutes to save a 5-year-old girl kidnapped from her front yard. Right? I don't know if we've seen any large-scale cases on that. Thank you, Rodney. Appreciate the support. But yeah, so shout out to Tamar. Now, this might be something that's a little familiar to some of you, right? 69 black boys padlocked in the dormitory at school when it was set on fire in 1959 in Wrightsville, Arkansas. Any thoughts on this, BGS?
Man, I was hoping most of them survived, but this is fairly common. And these are the men that we actually know about. Thousands of bodies are buried that will never be found.
Right, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, as we talked about off air, a couple of days ago, and I remember watching a documentary at Fresno State where the documentary maker came to the campus and talked about interviewing an elderly white male who was a child in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when the massacre took place, and he watched as a child at the local cemetery them loading black bodies into a hay baler. I think that's the proper term for it. And the flesh was literally fed into the dirt on the ground. So where you had bodies that were there, and of course whites who were buried later, they were literally buried in what were the remains of black folk who were killed in Tulsa. So the kind of careless treatment, the horrendous treatment of black men, again, is still prevalent. And again, I show this too because it still kind of goes into tonight's topic too, about black boys. So in this instance, 1959, March 5th, 13 to 17-year-old boys who were experiencing this at the Negro Boys Industrial School in Wrightsville. Around 4 a.m., fire mysteriously ignited, forcing the boys to fight and claw their way out of the burning building. It's an event in history possibly forgotten or unknown by many, but it's that moment that claimed the lives of 21 boys. It was a carefully calculated murder. but was designed to kill 69 that were housed inside the dormitory, said Frank Lawrence. He has made it his life's mission to uncover the truth surrounding what he calls the Arkansas secret Holocaust. When the smoke cleared that March morning in 1959, the boys who burned to death were found piled on top of one another in the corner of the dormitory. The 48 who had survived managed to escape by prying off mesh metal screens from 2 windows. The horrific event briefly made headlines that also brought attention to the squalor and deplorable conditions in which the boys lived. Right. So again, this was something we happened to find out about, but as you said, these are the stories that we actually got some recording about. Shout out to Underdog Glory. Appreciate that support. All right. So again, feeding into aspects of tonight, the treatment of not only black men but black boys. Recent one here. Tamar Braxton's boyfriend reportedly files restraining order against her for domestic violence. This was actually an African brother that she was highlighting about how much she appreciated him not long before this and how supportive he was, and then this happened. So
yeah, a lot of undiagnosed mental illness by Tamar.
Absolutely.
That's the thing. That's why she divorced her former husband actually divorced her because of domestic violence. Where they were actually in malls getting in fist fights.
Absolutely. And I post this mainly because every time I talk about intimate partner violence, I always get people, and I've had this from academics, right? Where black men can't be abused. They're incapable of it. And I get black men to say the same thing. T Fitness, appreciate the support, but I get black men to say the same thing. Black men can't be abused. And really what we're talking about is we're in a scenario, right? Particularly since the Duluth model in the 1980s, but what that's mushroomed into is, it's not about whether or not you can handle a woman toe to toe. That's not what this is about. It's about if you respond in any kind of physical manner, right? You are far more subject to go to prison than she is. You know what I mean? So you have black men who are backed into a corner mainly due to the proxy influence of the state. It's not about her, because the response I hear from black men, well, I can take her. I can take her. I have one brother, there ain't no woman that can take me. I'm like, well, first of all, I've seen videos where that's not the case, but that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is simply that because of the way our national culture has progressed, the laws, the policies on the books, and the way that those things are interpreted, it tends to stand in a manner where you have to pretty much risk your livelihood, your reputation. If you protect yourself from a woman, you still have to risk all of that. And so, why you'll see professional black men like this even filing for restraining orders and whatnot, he has no other recourse, right? Even if he just holds her in place, if she decides to make the argument that he's aggressed her, that can be the end of that.
Yeah, that's been the case for a very long time. Even before the Violence Against Women Acts, that's been the case where a woman could actually pick up a phone or go down to the local law enforcement, have you picked up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to kind of post this as a reminder that no black man is beyond experiencing this. I don't care how tough you are. I don't care how big you are. It's not about that. It's really a policy issue. It's really an interpretation issue, and it's really a systemic misandry in place in terms of the assumption of what black men are at the end of the day. Some of you may have seen this. This is in Sarasota, right? Sheriff's Deputy Neil Pizzo, I think is how you pronounce his name. If you watch this, you can see that the boy is actually just putting his hands in his shirt because he's cold. And yet what ends up happening is that this sheriff's deputy was placed on paid leave for choking and slamming and beating him. And the boy was hospitalized afterwards, right? So all of this because he was cold.
And oh man, and the black officers helping him.
You see what I mean? So again, we just as we just even broach the topic, are black boys property of the state?
Mm-hmm.
You can see somewhat where I'm going with that in terms of how black boys are even perceived, right? And this is the kind of treatment that can start as young as 5 years old, because according to some of the data, it's even at that age where black boys are seen and treated like they're much older than they actually are. You know, but you can see that it's not just about being perceived as older; it's also about being perceived as a threat. Chemistry, appreciate that support. Um, but I thought it necessary to kind of show what we're looking at. I see a number of other police come
Wow,
in the room.
did they really need that many police was it a 13-year-old boy?
See that? Yeah, teenager. This boy was criminally assaulted, really. Had
Mm-hmm.
to be hospitalized after this. Right.
Wow.
So, yeah. Let's see here. That's not what I wanted to do. Okay. Damn. Okay. Interesting image that I thought I would share as well. Right. This country has a very particular history when it comes to, especially black men, even when it's not stated out loud that that's what it is. But this just to put into context what we're dealing with. I'm gonna see if I can bring this up because I wanted to tie this to something a little bit later. The slide came up a little early, but again, I don't mind showing it here as a reminder of the environment that we're in and the historical context of it. All right. So even though you're not going to see this kind of thing openly stated in many ways, as you might have seen at a different era, based on the last image we saw, you can see that the legacy of it, one way, form, or fashion, still exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can tell just by the previous image, by the previous video, that it still exists.
$200 a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let's see. I'm going to skip through some of these pretty quickly. You guys know Amber Heard. Apparently, she's still going to show up in Aquaman 2, despite her treatment of Johnny Depp. And the reason I bring that out is, I'm not really having a long conversation about Johnny Depp, but it's really about precedent and how these kind of things impact black males. So she is actually caught on recorded devices abusing him psychologically and physically, and yet very little in terms of repercussions. And so you just kind of want to keep your eye on some of these things, because they definitely, again, set precedent for how any man can be affected. This is Hollywood and Harvard-educated film producer Charles Belk walking to his car to check the time left on his parking meter when officers handcuffed him. 51-year-old who's produced NAACP Image Awards said the cops never told him why he was under investigation, didn't realize they had the wrong tall, bald head black male for 6 hours. It's one of those things that you hear about, but never think it would happen to you, according to Belk. That's at least what he wrote on his Facebook page, all because I was identified as the wrong tall, bald head black male. He was supposed to spend the night at a swanky Emmys party, not in a holding cell. Wow. So, again, sometimes I hear people say, well, as long as you dress a certain way and you have the right degrees and you speak the King's English, these things don't happen to you. They only happen to a certain segment of the population. I know from personal experience that's not true, but in case you need these kind of examples, here you go. Let's see here. Black to Film, what's up? Good to see you in here. D Remedy, appreciate that support. Okay. Now, transitioning out of this, we're going to talk a little bit about y'all. I told you before, we're going to do blackmail political agenda updates as they occur. Meaning that if I come up with something that I think needs to go on that list, or you send me something that is added to this list, I will cover it on a regular basis. Because again, I think that we need a platform, and more than that, we need an agenda that we can articulate very clearly and in bulleted format when necessary. I think when we have conversations in the Black community about a Black agenda, there's no assumption that Black males may have distinct issues that are different from anyone else's, or that there might be something credible that can come out of that discussion. So that said, I like to kind of, put them up whenever I cover the latest addition to them, because I want you brothers to have these in your arsenal as something to consider. And as you reflect upon this and decide about what kind of political action to take over the next number of years, we actually have something to refer to, in regard to where we're at. So, as you can see, in terms of the first 8, with mandatory DNA testing at birth, these are not listed in any particular order other than the order that they came in. That's it. So it's not based on order of importance, but family court reform in regard to, child custody, alimony, and different things of that nature. Single sex education. This was one proposed by Brother BGS. And I think it's going to come up when we get to today's latest addition to this list. Targeted programs for Black male homeless. Much of that tends to be something that impacts most especially brothers getting out of prison. But in an instance, like we're seeing now with COVID and the economy we have, and I just drove by a brother pushing a cart earlier today. So this is something quite prevalent that's impacting Black men in extremely high numbers. I think 6-7 months ago, we found that Black folk were half of the country's homeless. But what people usually don't say is what percentage of that is Black and male, and not homeless in terms of you're sleeping on a friend's couch, but homeless in terms of you're living in a tent city. That tends to often be Black male. Targeted programs dealing with unemployment. Criminal sentencing reform, meaning that Black men should not be hyper sentenced any more than any other group for the same crime. Anti-hyper incarceration policy, intimate partner violence and homicide policy reform, meaning that evidence actually be proffered rather than Black men or going to being assumed to be guilty just off the bat, right? And then we have some later additions that I've covered in previous shows about the Duluth model, at-fault divorce standards, things of that nature. So you can look through, you can screenshot it if you need to. Ron, appreciate that support. But definitely remember to reflect on them. And it's not even a matter of whether or not everybody agrees on everything. It's more just getting a dialogue going about what's important. Let me see. The latest page we have here, licensing law enforcement in terms of, have law enforcement having revocable licenses. Bjorn, appreciate that support. Targeted cancer campaign and treatment and recognition, and targeted in terms of Black males and their experiences with it. I talked about this in the last show. The percentages of diagnosed cancer as well as mortality rates are extremely high, to the point where Black males tend to die most, comparatively speaking, from cancer. And we talked about this in light of Chadwick Boseman. Mm-hmm. So we need to definitely talk about some targeted work toward Black men in that regard. Small business support, as I said earlier, types of support that Black men are not targeted for, despite that others are. But the latest addition for today is what we might refer to as the preparatory reading / STEM educational support notion. And basically what this refers to is that, as you can see, we're proposing a percentage, 10% of city, state, and federally targeted resources that normally goes into incarceration be diverted into the creation of educational after-school programs, particularly targeted at ADOS Black boys. Even funds earmarked for special ed can be used to draft, male college level teaching assistants to create an all male educational support structure. Also provides tax breaks for private companies who may philanthropically donate materials, tech, etc. And lastly, that cable and internet companies be incentivized by federal/tax policy or breaks to provide free high-speed internet. I wanted to shout BGS out for this because he helped me kind of flesh this out. But any thoughts to add to this, the importance of this, or what's going on with it?
The importance is um, that these problems are solvable. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
with the technology that we have, with the information that we have, with the infrastructure that we have, these problems are solvable. Okay, and the thing is, not only are they solvable, they can actually cost you less money in the long run. Because, like I was telling you earlier, in California, it takes $75,000 to incarcerate an inmate in a California prison. Okay, I said you could send him to, you can get him a master's with that kind of money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, for 1 year of putting him in prison, you can actually give a man a master's degree. And the thing is that if you just take 10%, I was saying if you take a portion of it, 10%, and they actually dedicated to programs for black boys, you can actually reverse what was happening. I think you said the percentage rate. I don't know where you got the stat from. Where
Oh, well, we're going to get into that.
okay. Well, the thing
Yeah.
is that a lot of black boys are needlessly in special education. They're needlessly underscoring in performance metrics, and the biggest reason is that the educational system is not geared for them. It's actually geared for a white woman or for a white female.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and if you go in order of importance, white female, white male, black female, black male. Um, guess who gets the lowest portion of the stick, which is black
Mm-hmm.
males. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if we really wanted to solve this problem, you would give it to the people that need it most, which are black males. But unfortunately, those are the ones that ignored most. And basically, like I said, these are solvable problems. Like um, Patrick Moynihan said that back in 1965, if you want to improve black family life, you improve the life of the black male.
Mm-hmm.
You give him uh, uh, a masculine based education, masculine based jobs, masculine based training. You know, he said with the single sex schools, he said it with armed forces, put them in a masculine environment that will actually change and actually change the environment, change the outcome of black boys. Because even he said it back then. No matter where a black boy starts, he escapes poverty for one generation only. So you're always one generation away from going back down to the bottom where you were, and that was proven in the statistics. But I forget the economists that actually did that like a couple of years ago, where they actually proved that black boys are more prone to drop out of the class structure down to the bottom than any other group.
Well, shout out to Grown Man Business and to MLR. Appreciate the support. We got Art New Style in the building in the comment section. Shout out to you, brother.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, no, you're definitely right, and I think it's important we have this conversation because, and the reason you see reading in there, and we'll get to reading in more detail in a moment.
Yeah.
But it's I tie it to STEM because obviously STEM fields are the way of the future.
You can't do STEM if you can't
Right.
you can't read and you can't do higher level math. You
Right.
can't do STEM. It's impossible.
Exactly.
It's
Well,
impossible.
and much of the data suggests too that with the increased amount of reading and the reading aptitude, we
Yes.
see an increase in performance in regard to math and science as well. Right. So
if you can't do math, if you can't do reading and logic, because mathematics is based on logic. If you can't do logical reading, actually perceive what actually get information out of what you read and actually turn it into a logical problem, then you can't do STEM at all because STEM is based on problem solving. And if you can't get the basics down, then you can't do STEM, which is probably why the vast majority of students, much less black boys, can't do STEM. You have to, before you even get to STEM, you have to prepare that male from the time he's in kindergarten to the time he gets to high school. If you don't do that, he's not going to be able to do it. So STEM course is not going to be able to do anything if you don't have candidates to be in them.
And that's not even addressing the diminished confidence that boys will experience as they, especially if they're passed up grade wise, but they don't have the requisite skills at each level.
Mm-hmm.
The diminished confidence is going to affect their performance as well, which means that if and when they finish high school, they're still not apt to be able to compete or have
Mm-hmm.
a willingness to, if they've already experienced years of being out of the discussion, so to speak. But I do want to say this is in terms of what inspired some of this, because we're going to go into why I'm adding this to the Black male political agenda, a
Mm-hmm.
very targeted focus on Black boys in education. What inspired it was something that was posted to my page on Facebook a few days ago, and that had to do with this image here.
Mm.
This is in Louisiana, right? And the source of it is American Prison, a reporter's undercover journey into the business of punishment. It's a piece by Shane Bauer. And basically, what it talks about is that Black women were said to be were put in cells with male prisoners, and some became pregnant. In 1848, legislators passed a new law declaring that all children born in the penitentiary of African American parents serving life sentences would be property of the state.
Mm.
The women would raise the kids until the age of 10, at which point the penitentiary would place an ad in the newspaper. 30 days later, the children would be auctioned off on the courthouse steps for cash on delivery. The proceeds were used to fund schools for white children. Many of the Black children were purchased by prison officials, right? This image here, looking at it, I saw my son, I saw myself. I saw a million Black kids that I grew up with and worked with over the years, and yet very little conversation, not only about this particular legacy, but what ways the perceptions of Black males have continued on to this era, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we're looking at when we talk about property of the state, it doesn't necessarily have to be as formal as prisoners who are giving birth to children in prisons that are used as slave labor, but a particular perspective on Black males in general and a servile, underdeveloped position that many still serve in to this day. And this ties to what Tarian brought up earlier. No, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing that. Is it Tarian?
Terrain, yeah.
Tarian, I'm sorry. What he brought up earlier. He actually was bringing this up here. Right? Parents outraged. Police show up at their home after their son's teacher complained about him waving a toy gun. Actually, he had a toy gun in his bedroom while he was attending class virtually. And from there, he was, he had the principal called on him. He was given, or I think they tried to expel him, and then the police showed up at his family's door. And this is the kid in the middle here, right? Because he had a toy gun in his bedroom,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the perception of this boy as something dangerous, as something that the authorities had to be called in on, right? Simply as he's attending class, right? That whole idea of Black males being a threat, and thus the punishment industry, right? Having to be called in. Well, what is the punishment industry for Black boys? What does that entail? What does it mean? Well, I mean, in interesting fashion, it often means juvenile punishment. It usually means a facility, right? And in that facility, it becomes a preparatory stage,
Mm-hmm.
right, for the prison, the school to prison pipeline, but for future imprisonment in and of itself. But when you look at some of the arbitrary reasons for why some of this happens, it can be something as simple as this, right? And this is the legacy of that 1848 policy. It is the legacy of Black boys being nothing but bodies for the state. It's the same idea where Black boys are not considered really as human, but considered for just raw physicality, considered as dangerous, considered as threatening, and if anything, considered as useful in regard to being cannon fodder.
Which is where the name human resource came from.
Right. Please explain it. Please break
Basically,
it.
the slaves were the human resources, the human machines that built the country. That's where
Mm.
the name human resource came from. They weren't looked at as humans. They were looked at as animals, just more like like cows or pigs or something like that. They were looked at as resources were never looked at as men.
Shout out to Gold Professor. Shout out to BP. Thanks for the support. When you think of human resources and you think of the bodies that are the machines of today, I think of prisons. I think of prison labor. I think of labor that not only has no union representation, but can have no payment at all, and nobody would be the wiser. Even when prisoners have organized to try and complain, there's no platform for that, right? But again, this doesn't start in adulthood. I mean, we talk about incarceration and we talk about it in terms of how it impacts adult Black males, but we often overlook that this starts much younger than this.
No, the school to prison pipeline. They tell you it starts in the third grade.
Absolutely. And you can see it in the grades of fourth grade boys and beyond, fourth grade and up, and you can see it as early as that. But you also see it in the stories they tell about how they're treated in their classrooms, and so on and so forth. But let's take it a step further. Again, going in on why I talked about this idea that I'm adding to the Black male political agenda in regard to reading and STEM preparation programs has to do with a piece I was shown and had a chance to look through by one Matthew Lynch. This is 2017, A Guide to Ending the Crisis Among Young Black Males. And one of the things he points out was so it's not a matter of a lot of the time what I find happens, at least for me, is I will be aware of something and then I'll see the data presented in a slightly different way. And the next thing I know, my hands are shaking. You know what I mean? It's not about not knowing at all. It's just about, just seeing the data in a slightly different way that kind of reminds you of how visceral, this treatment of Black boys is. So according to Lynch, what he talks about here, he says only 10% of 8th grade Black boys in the U.S. are proficient in reading. Now, I want to stop there just for a second. One of the things I talked about, and you guys hear me say this, I repeat it damn near like a mantra every show, right, is that in California, 70% of Black boys are effectively illiterate in K through 12 system, 70%. And the largest university system in the country, the Cal State University system, 70% of Black males, these are the Black males that make it to the Cal State University system, 70% of them drop out their first year. But on a national scale, what we're looking at is that 10% of 8th grade Black boys in the U.S. are proficient in reading. So that means from kindergarten to 8th grade, only 10% are able to read on any kind of competent level on a national scale. And in urban areas like Chicago and Detroit, the number is even lower. Right? How exactly do you compete when it comes to math and science? How exactly do you compete when it comes to going into STEM? I've had brothers that have commented on my show privately and publicly, and they said, well, Doc, the answer is STEM fields. Everybody doesn't have to go to college. They can just go to STEM. You're overlooking STEM. I'm like, word?
You know how bad it actually gets? Because I talked to Officer Faulkner, right? The reason that there's not more Black boys in the military? They can't pass the test. They can't read. So their way out could be the military, but they can't even read to pass the test.
This is where we're at.
Which is something that Moynihan said back in freaking 1965. How come you can't have more Black men in the military? Because they can't read.
Because they can't read. And I would say in previous eras, the reading level was higher because you could have males participating to different degrees. But I think when we talk about the post Brown versus Board educational segregation that we've seen in communities, I'd argue that it's been getting worse. But the next sentence is even as much, is just as striking. By contrast, the 2013 National Assessment of Education Progress found that 46% of white students are adequate readers by the 8th grade, and 17% of Black students as a whole are too. Right? So there's a specially designated place for Black boys. And I think we dramatically underestimate the impact of reading, right, on a long-term life scale. We underestimate how important reading is. And so this is why I wanted to introduce this on the Black male political agenda, because if our kids aren't reading, there's almost a life sentence that they are branded with. There's a scarlet letter that kind of gets attached to that because they're not able to participate or compete on an incredible level. So what would be simplistic solutions like, oh, let's just create STEM programs, now become a whole nother problem because you might be dealing with an adult Black male. And I've seen this in my classes over the years. I've been teaching for 22 years. I have seen young men who have learned how to finesse others. They've learned soft skills about how to relate, how to make you feel good, how to laugh, how to do all of these kind of things, but to do it in a manner where they can, they can actually slide by the fact that they can't read and get you to not think about it. Believe it or not, and this is a random example, but I remember an episode of The Cosby Show where Sammy Davis Jr. was a guest, if I'm not mistaken, and he played an elder gentleman. Well, of course he was an elder gentleman, right? But he played one who was illiterate at his age, and he was so good at schmoozing people that they would, he would be able to gloss over the fact that he couldn't read and actually get other people to do things for him to compensate for the fact that he couldn't read. So you're talking about people who have highly adapted. You remember in the 80s, we used to be able to talk about, functional drug addicts,
right?
Who could hold high-level jobs, but they were essentially drug. It's not dissimilar from that. People who were highly functional but completely illiterate. And I think that situation has gotten worse, statistically speaking. But when you look at the percentages of other groups that can read compared to what's going on with Black boys, it's dramatic, right?
Yeah.
Any reflection? Go ahead.
And I think I think automation, especially when it comes to like the smartphone, is probably making it worse. Where you don't really have to read, you don't really have to spell. The phone does a lot of work for you. You can actually speak into the phone instead of reading or writing or processing information. So it's probably actually making it worse.
Officer Faulkner, let me know if you want to come on in. Red Pill Daddy, appreciate that support. Let's see. All right. Okay, so let me finish this. The achievement gap between two races is startling, but the difference between the NAEP report on Black students as a whole and the stats on Black boys is troubling. This is where the important dissection between at-risk groups needs to take place. It's not simply Black children in general who appear to be failing in the basics like literacy. It is the boys. Now, this is what's important about what Matthew is saying here, because a lot of the time, you guys hear me talk about flat Blackness.
Right.
Flat Blackness, when you're talking about race, is a whole different concept. It refers to, if you took me, because this is something that Yvette Carnell talks a lot about. When you talk about flat Blackness in a racial context, it's the ways in which flattening the idea of Blackness kind of erases the particular lineage experiences of different groups, like ADOS, like Jamaican Americans, or Nigerian Americans, so on and so forth. But flat Blackness in a gendered context, the way I refer to it, I use it to talk about the ways that the Black agenda is generalized for all Black people, even if those who are disproportionately suffering are Black males, and that gets swept under the rug. But when we do break out the data on gender, it's okay to particularize it to Black girls, to Black women, to LGBTs, but not when it comes to Black males, be they young or old, and not when it comes to heterosexual Black males. So again, because of this kind of intersectionality-based identity calculus, heterosexual Black males are to be ignored. They are to be downplayed, even if they're the ones suffering the greatest. So when we talk about a population of girls, for example, who transition into womanhood and tend to be the demographic that is most highly enrolled in higher education, we're not talking about reading programs that need to happen for them in K through 12 because they don't need them.
Right.
And if you're not allowed to bring up the boys, then the discussion just doesn't tend to happen. But how in the hell do you have a 70% illiteracy rate in an entire state, one of the states that has an economy that surpasses many countries in the world, like California, and yet nobody's talking about this? And then on a national scale, you have about 10% that are proficient in reading. And there's no out. Have you heard any outcry about this?
Yeah, it's a social crime in a first world country. I mean, if this was any place else in the world, it would be an international outrage.
Well, and this is the thing. Even in our own community, it would be an internet. It would be an outrage. I mean,
It
and I
should be.
said this in my last show. Can
Mm.
you imagine what would happen, right, if we woke up tomorrow morning and even our girls were reading at black male levels? What would our families do? How would that be perceived? Right. This goes into the whole notion of, this is something I saw in my generation coming up. The black girls were sent to college. The black
Hmm.
boys were sent to get jobs.
Yeah.
Right. The focus on leadership for the next generation, the focus on who the resources should go into as far as educational advancement, were fixated on the girls.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I've even seen this in my own family. I have very close family members, female family members, who were given computers, who were transitioned into community college while still in high school. There was for me, it was just like, well,
The black women have a network, and the
yeah,
black men are not allowed to have one,
absolutely.
even amongst our own community.
Hmm.
Because if there's a black male network, then the women want to come in and take it over.
Yeah, because you can't have anything earmarked for boys, and
No.
that's the other thing. It's treated as, if you focus and target it on the boys, it is inherently a disrespect and an attempt at maligning black girls or women. That's the basic assumption. It's not even up for dialogue. It's
Hmm.
just merely the assumption. I mean, I've presented at academic conferences on black boy targeted research, and the very first question I will get 90% of the time is, why didn't you talk about black girls?
Hmm.
And I've talked about this. I will count them in the book. When you go to a conference, some conferences, they'll give you a book of everybody who's presenting and
Hmm.
what they're presenting on and what rooms they'll be in. I will, every time I go to a conference, the night I get there, I pull that book out, sit at the desk in my hotel room, and I literally count how many presentations are on black males. And what I have found in the last 5 years, I just started counting 5 years ago, is that there are generally 10 times as many projects at these conferences that are on black girls and women than there are on black boys and men. And
Yeah.
when you go to the panels for black girls and women, it's all women. When you go to the panels for boys, there's this idea that the panels have to be diverse. So if you're not dealing with girls, or you don't have women or girls present, that you're inherently contributing to whatever problem in regard to sexism or misogyny is on the table. But there's none of that that's brought to these presentations on black girls and women. So black boys, yet again, find themselves not part of the discussion. And yet, look at the data that we're presenting on what boys are experiencing.
Yeah, that was the reason for the Kerner Commission, because, like I said, when we shifted from more of an agricultural or to an industrial based society, what they found out is that the black men who rarely uh, graduated from high school. I think back then when they were looking at it, I think the graduation rate for black men was like maybe 22% from high school. And so these boys were do normally drop out like the seventh or eighth grade, weren't educated enough to actually get these factory jobs. We're not talking about STEM. We're not talking about
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, talk about the university jobs. We're not talking about corporate jobs. Just
Right.
regular factory jobs. They were
Right.
not educated enough to actually have those jobs, which is
Mm-hmm.
why they made that big push in the late '60s and in '70s and part of the '80s to actually increase the education of black men, because if you go all the way back to the Mohawk Conference of 1890, they had determined that it was not necessary to
Mm-hmm.
educate black men. It was not necessary to teach black men to read.
Mm-hmm.
That skill would lie within the black women.
Mm-hmm.
We teach them to read, teach them to write, teach them to do that, because they said they had to educate their children and finance the house, basically um, do the bills and finance the house, run the household. So all the
Mm-hmm.
black man had to do was basically learn a trade, go to work, and hand over his check to
Mm-hmm.
the wife, which is something that I saw that most black men saw back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even the 70s. And I've
Mm-hmm.
had women that I work with talk about their husbands when they were young,
Mm-hmm.
that um, the husband will be working at a factory, and they have a pay shack, right? A paymaster shack, like just inside the fence of the factory where they're at, right? Where people go pick up their checks. He
Mm-hmm.
said there was a line of black women every Friday to come pick up their husband's check.
Mm.
because they're the ones that would have to write out the bills and do the kind of paperwork, because their husbands were not educated to the same degree they were. So this is
Right.
an ongoing problem. So this is just a reflection of what has always been. But now we're transitioning
Bills and in. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
into a new society,
Mm-hmm.
into a new society where you cannot even get a job unless you can meet certain criteria. And now
Right.
we have to backtrack, because this is a travesty.
Right.
This should have been taken care of back in 1968. This should not happen.
Mm-hmm. But and I'm glad you introduced that, because I want to be clear. I'm not highlighting this as an arbitrary thing that is just happening to black boys and it's bad. This is a very targeted and purposeful agenda as far as underdeveloping black males. And I've talked about this repeatedly, especially from the 1960s and 70s onward. I argue has been a direct response to the civil rights movement or any type of black activism in general. To undermine the boys, to advance the girls. That is the crux of what I call the promotion demotion thesis. By separating that community out and then allowing other groups who have different ideologies when it came to whether it was feminism, LGBT theory, and activism, student movements, all of these in the 70s became a convenient way of further underdeveloping any type of black activist front by separating people along what we might call a very early draft of intersectionality that has justified the separation of the community along these ideological lines. So I don't look at what's going on with black boys as accidental. I think especially when you look at Jim Sidanius's work and his treatment of outgroup males, it definitely speaks to a very targeted agenda, but it's one we have data on and we can highlight how impactful it is. Shout out to Black Uru Strikes. I appreciate you spreading the word for the support. Please support the channel. And I also want to shout out Triggerman, IBMOR. Appreciate that support, man. But let me continue, because there's more I want to show you. Some of this but it's still good to put numbers to it, right? So, and this is still part of the article by Matthew Lynch, right? Did you know that black boys are more likely than any other group to be placed in special ed classes, with 80% of all special ed students being black or Hispanic males? Black boys account for 20% of U.S. students labeled as mentally retarded, even though they represent just 9% of the population. On the other end of the extreme, black boys are 2.5 times less likely to be classified as gifted and talented, even if their academic record shows that potential.
I'm not surprised.
You have any experience with that, sir? In some way, shape, or form?
You know what? I had to fight really hard to keep my son out of special education, because he was in kindergarten. The two things they wanted to do: put him in special ed and give him Ritalin, because they say he was too hyperactive. He wasn't paying attention. And this was in kindergarten. This wasn't third grade. It's kindergarten. His first semester of kindergarten. So I know what you're talking about. This is the targeting of black males.
Right.
And the thing is, his mother was ready to go along with it, and I had to pitch a fit for that not to happen.
Shout out to Green Gorilla, the G with the PhD. He's in the comment section. He said the bill to establish the Commission on the Social Status of Black Men and Boys is passed. So shout out for that bit of information. No, absolutely. And I've told this story before. The same happened with my son in 2 weeks into kindergarten. They tried the same thing. I remember when I came to have a meeting with the teacher, my son sat next to me, and she made us wait for about 10, 15 minutes before she came and sat down. But apparently she was looking at us from the other room. And the very first question she asked me was, does he always act this way when you're around him? And I said, what way? Well, he's just sitting there. And I was like, well, in my class, he's a terror. He's running around. He's doing this and doing that. I said, okay. The next few weeks, I would come in unexpectedly and sit in the class because, I had the time, which unfortunately a lot of other parents don't, and I would come in and sit in, and I would notice that, to the extent that he was out of his chair, and this is kindergarten, right? He's 5. But to the extent that he is out of his chair, I didn't notice a difference. Matter of fact, I would catalog it. I didn't notice a difference between how often he was up and around and how often the other kids were, particularly the white kids. The difference was in the teacher's response, right?
Mm-hmm.
She was far more affirming, and she gave a lot of what I call tactile approval. She would walk up and touch the kids that she felt were doing well, or she felt weren't challenged enough by the material. But more and more, I noticed her treatment of Black and brown kids was different. She wouldn't give that tactile approval. Now, understand, it doesn't sound like much, but when you're 5 years old, right, you might have an emotional reaction to this and not know how to articulate it. And this is the behavior that she was engaged in when I'm sitting in the room, right? So when I'm not in the room, my 5-year-old can't tell me, the particular things that he's noticing happening in the class. But nonetheless, this is something I can see. So in that very first meeting, again, she tried to put him in the special ed, and she suggested that I get him on Ritalin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, none of that did he need. I mean, within a year and a half, he was, reading 700-page Harry Potter books, cover to cover. Top 1 to 2 in every class he's in. But he's, you want to send him into special ed.
Right.
And if you already don't know what the special ed agenda is, it may force you to ask, well, how many other Black boys were sent that didn't belong there?
Yeah. And the thing is, and they're incentivized to put Black boys in special ed.
Mm-hmm.
Just like this. I mean, you've heard this before, where they will get the female to actually co-sign on putting them in special ed and putting them on a medication because they will get a check.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he incentivize the repression of Black males by not only by the white teachers, but also by our own women,
Mm-hmm.
instead of doing the opposite.
Well, and you can see the difference in terms of the opposite in the treatment of girls.
Mm.
All right, we don't see the requisite numbers, but there's still more. This next slide. This is actually out of a different report, Overrepresentation of African American males in Special Ed Programs, Implications and Advocacy Strategies for School Counselors. All right, this was a piece done by a teacher, if I'm not mistaken. Current statistics indicate that African American boys represent only 9% of the total student enrollment in public schools, yet in the category of mental retardation, their enrollment percentage is more than double. In other categories, such as emotional disturbance and learning disability, African American males are again overly represented, accounting for 21 and 12% respectively, U.S. Department of Ed. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This is what we're looking at. And so when we go to the charts, right, percentage of public school students who received out-of-school suspensions by race and ethnicity and sex, and this is the hard part. It's not always, you don't always find the data, disaggregated by gender, right? You'll see it, they might do it racially, but to find it done racially and in terms of gender isn't always easy. And some of the charts that just really give you some in-depth information are not broken up by gender. But when we do see what we can, what can we make out here? Any thoughts on this?
I mean, like you said, they always you can see that the males are far higher than the females,
and higher than any other group,
and higher than any other group.
Yeah, absolutely. 17.6, right?
In fact, the Black females are closer to the norm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Closer
go ahead.
No, closer to the norm of the other races, people.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly. This is a slightly older one. I put this in a blog piece I wrote some years ago, but I thought it worth revisiting. Representation of Black males in U.S. schools versus special ed,
mm-hmm.
right? 2011, 2012. You can see how it breaks down in terms of public schools and special ed, right?
Yeah.
According to U.S. Department of Education. Let's see.
And they get more money for special ed students.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think they get 25 to 30% more for special ed students. So it incentivizes schools to actually put these Black boys into these programs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then one of the things I'll hear people say is, well, we just need our own schools, which I of course agree with, but what is the main problem that tends to impact us over and over again when it comes to that subject? I mean, we can identify some schools in different places, Black
mm-hmm.
schools that have done some excellent work. I think I think Marcus Garvey in LA is a great example of that. But what is the most consistent and plaguing issue when it comes to independent schooling for Black folk.
Funding,
Yeah.
money.
And we're talking about a group that suffers from a lack of wealth, particularly inherited wealth, which is where the majority of wealth is passed down. And we're not even talking about the wealth among families when families merge in terms of marriage, right? A lot of the time, shout out to Kevin Samuels, we talk about marriage. Among other groups, marriage becomes a very strategic thing of aligning families along the lines of wealth.
Right.
That's not necessarily a practice we hear about in the Black community in the same kind of way. We tend to marry for love, and that is the extent to which that is, if we're going to talk about marriage at all, it's usually love based. But marriage has been declining for decades, primarily because of the impact on wealth,
On wealth,
right?
yes.
Which is why we were calling for family court reform, because it doesn't necessarily stay in the family in a constructive way, but it ends up becoming something that Black males have to suffer from. And so in that said, whether we're talking about inherited wealth, or we're talking about wealth through family and marriage, whether we're talking about wealth in terms of what assets we own, this has been a long-term, or one of the major long-term impacts of having limited wealth, is that you're not able to provide the kind of not intimate, but distinct and specific resources necessary at a given point in time, like independent schools. I mean, if that was the case, we'd have independent Black schools in every city across the country that Black folk live in. But we're often struggling along those lines.
Yeah, well, even a lot of the schools that have started independent actually had to close for lack of funding.
Absolutely.
Lack of funding and low teacher pay because they couldn't get the teachers.
Which is one of the things that's actually deferred many Black men from going into teaching. When you're socially expected to still provide and protect, but you don't have the means, going into an industry that is known for paying below market value it has long-term effects. And I'm not going to talk about Dr. Umar Johnson in any kind of negative way, but I think one of the things we can say in looking at what's been going on with his push for a Black male school, if nothing else, how much it actually takes to develop a school and maintain it. If we don't walk away with anything else, and again, I'm not going to disparage the brother, but I'm just simply going to say, if we don't walk away with nothing else, just how much it takes and how consistently and what the infrastructure needs to be for that kind of thing to be maintained.
Exactly.
That should teach us quite a bit. Let me see. So here you can see race and gender out of school suspensions. Again, broken down by race and gender. Right. So
wow.
Right. So 20% of boys. And the closest you get to that are Native American boys. Right. But again, and some of the things you'll see bits of this data presented in very questionable ways. If you look at the African American Policy Forum, which is kind of a Black feminist think tank, I remember they were put out charts some years ago where they'd say, Black girls are the most suspended group in the country, right? And really, what they were saying was Black girls are the most suspended group of girls. But they would take out the of girls, right, to highlight the need of Black girls. But again, we weren't going to talk about how they were actually transitioning into college in record numbers. And we weren't going to talk about what the boys' rates were. So as you can see here, when you actually show the data, the boys are twice as bad off.
Yeah, and the thing is that that's funny. Like you were saying, it's flat Black when it's negative, but it's not. When they want resources, they want to feel pitied. It's flat Black. When it's something that's positive, it's something they really want, then they actually separate it out. In other words, we'll use your oppression to work for us.
Absolutely, when it's convenient.
When it's convenient.
So you might see charts where they'll say something like 30% of Black kids are suffer from out of school suspensions, and we need to really target what our girls experience. And I'm not saying we don't need to target our girls. I'm not saying that at all. I definitely think we need to. I want to be clear about that, because I think a lot of the times, especially in these spaces on social media where Black men have begun to center themselves in a particular way, any kind of critique of Black women and girls is taken as an attack. That's not what this is about. It's about the disingenuous way that Black boys have been eliminated from certain key conversations. And yes, sometimes even by Black women, even academics, even scholars, but also Black men. In
True.
terms of supporting this kind of feminist agenda of centering girls, and again, using this intersectionality based identity calculus, the ways in which Black males, particularly boys, are made invisible in the discussion is offensive.
The thing is, what I don't understand is that when it comes to everybody else, they're supposed to get government help, community help, and everything else. When it comes to black males are supposed to pull their own selves up by the bootstrap. In other
Right.
words, we're supposed to alpha our way through it
Absolutely.
when nobody else does.
Hmm. And I hear from a lot of brothers that will do that very thing when we raise these discussions. We will try to alpha our way through it. Well, we shouldn't be vulnerable. We shouldn't point out our vulnerabilities. We just need to, just suck it up, take it, and walk it off. And it's like these are systemic issues that are multi-generational.
Yeah.
This is not. You can't walk this off. It doesn't. It doesn't work like that. It requires an institutional and systemic response. It can't be kind of muscled together on an individual basis, unfortunately. Here's another, right? In terms of discipline, Transform CRDC makes public long hidden data about which students are suspended, expelled, and arrested in schools. So desperate discipline rates. And you can see this one is particularly by race. But when it comes to black folks are the ones all in red. So out of school suspensions are actually the highest. You have expulsions at a fairly high rate just following that, and then in school suspensions and single out of school suspensions are equal, followed by overall enrollment. So you can see the kind of breakdown here for that. Yeah, and this one is just broken down by race as well, right? But nevertheless, the impact is particularly telling either way, right?
Yeah.
So,
The thing is that if you can't get the basics down, it's like anything else. If you can't get the basics down, then all the other programs like STEM and going to the military, all the other remedies that were actually more advanced aren't going to work.
mhm,
Because the biggest thing is the lack of candidates for even filling spots. I think I was talking to Brother Art New Style.
mhm,
They're trying to hold scholarships for Black males, but they don't have enough candidates because of what you just saw.
mhm,
There's not enough qualified candidates to even get the scholarships that are there.
mhm. But it's funny too because the way that's then interpreted is
Hmm.
it's not interpreted as okay, the lack of candidates is also a systemic response. I mean, a
Right,
systemic result, and
right,
therefore we need to remedy it with a systemic response. The view is, oh well, if there's a lack of candidates, it just means that these Black men aren't trying hard enough.
right,
And then I'll have conversations with Black educators who will tell me, well, we just, our boys are just not trying hard enough. They need to suck it up. And I'm like, how do they suck something up that's been going on since they've been in the womb?
right.
If everybody else is doing well and they're not, you got two ways of interpreting that. Either there's an inherent problem with the boys, which tends to be a conservative white kind of response to it,
Hmm.
or there's actually a systemic issue at play in terms of how many boys have access, what the particular barriers are they face, especially in regard to disproportionately negative treatment, low expectations, so on and so forth. But instead of looking at that, we will always, kind of problematize this on an individual level and make it the boys' fault.
Yeah, I mean, children. We're not talking about grown men. We're talking about children.
Mm-hmm.
It's so how can it be a kindergartner's fault?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How
And
can you
yet,
bring how can you
yeah.
brand a kindergartner? Because once you're in the like a special ed uh, um, program, basically you almost never get out.
Mm-hmm.
So you're dooming say if you had like my child, your son and my son have been allowed to actually be put on Ritalin and put in special ed, they'd have never gotten out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And yet, I find the number of people that are willing to look at that and take it, seriously is always a little striking to me because it's never quite as um, widespread as I would hope, even amongst those who study this. I'm often kind of blown away at the treatment of boys. And I've told this story several times, but yes, I've gone to conferences, and when it comes to the discussion on black boys,
Mm-hmm.
I will see academics speaking colloquially about black boys from personal experience, and that would be fine if it's measured up against some kind of data. But even that isn't always happening. And in a number of key conferences I've attended, it's been more just about, well, the boys need to try harder. Look at the girls; they're doing well, and that's kind of the other thing that happens. It's treated as it can't be a racial issue if the girls are doing well.
Yes.
Therefore, instead of saying there might be a targeted response to black boys, the answer is, well, the black boys are either inherently deficient or they're not trying hard.
I think it's more they're inherently deficient. That's what, depending on who you talk about. Like you said, it's always the black boys' fault, either biologically or socially. Yeah, they're not trying hard enough, or they're defective.
Absolutely. There's a couple of things I want to add. For those who don't know, I had a chance to be on Gus's show, The Cows, Context of White Supremacy, and he talked about a professor whose research I've used, whose work I've respected, but he talked about her research in regard to black males. And one of the things he pointed out was he had her on his show. Her name is Athena Matua, and she's the author of a number of things, but one of the texts that I've used from her is Progressive Black Masculinities. And it was one of the first books that came out that I particularly appreciated, because it was breaking from the traditional intersectionality model and attempting to explain black males outside of that, because she was recognizing that there's something more going on that intersectionality couldn't explain. So I appreciated her willingness to do this, especially as a black feminist. She was one of the first that I saw, really kind of push that. And so apparently when she interviewed on his show, he asked her about the existence of black male privilege. And her answer was, despite being one of these, groundbreaking, feminists who was willing to entertain that what's going on with black males is not being adequately explained,
right?
By feminist theory, she proffered the idea that black male privilege still existed, but she couldn't explain how, and she couldn't give any examples that were rooted in the data. And that,
I was on a show just yesterday, when the Roger Report. Shout out to the Roger Report. And he had a question in Facebook about black male privilege, right? Because somebody put a post up where she said that black males had privilege, and so he asked her where was it and how they actually use their privilege. She couldn't answer it, so he went and asked 100 women that he knew personally, did they believe black male privilege existed, and they all said yes, and same thing that you just said, but they couldn't prove it. They couldn't identify it. They couldn't actually show any existence of it, but they all agreed that it existed.
See, and you know what it is? It's really the residue of white feminism, right? Because when feminism was introduced to black women, it came with a material edge, to material incentivization, right? If you work with black feminism, you'll be able to get jobs. I mean, it was especially after the civil rights movement. There was no way in the world that relatively poor black women weren't going to go along with what feminism was proposing, because it offered, tangible benefits. But with the philosophy and ideology of feminism, what it also argued in regard to this whole conversation is that men were men across gender.
Right.
Matter of fact, shout out to Chadwick Boseman. I was just watching his film Marshall the other day. And, if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend go watch Marshall, go watch the James Brown film, go watch 42. Don't just limit yourself to Black Panther. Chadwick was quite talented. But one of the things he pointed out in Marshall, there was one of the guiding themes to the film is that men were men and women were women. But this was used in an inverse fashion in a philosophical discourse, in the feminist discourse, meaning that all men were the same. and white men and black men all enjoyed the same patriarchal position of exploiting women for their own benefit. And I've had feminist students that will tell me what they've learned in other classes, that this has gone since the beginning of time. So men have been patriarchal oppressors since the beginning of time, and because they're all men, they're all the same. But the data and the history tells us different. Even what we've covered just tonight, if you don't read anything else, right? It shows you that there is no similarity. Whether you're talking across racial lines, across class lines, age, health. I mean, there's so many different categories. Men are not the same. They're not a monolith by any means. But to take on this kind of monolithic position as feminists, to make the argument that black men were the same as white men, and therefore we need to take the same posture with black men that white women take with white men, right? That position unto itself already split the black community. Just that alone caused a massive rift, right? Where black men somehow became the enemy in alignment with white men. And you've never seen historically where black men and white men have aligned themselves together to oppress women. It hasn't worked. It's not realistic. There's no historical basis for it. And yet that argument people were comfortable with going with. But the irony to all of this, right, is that white women at that same time period made themselves, the most significant minority.
They did.
Right. So affirmative action, policies benefited them more than any other group, including black women.
Yeah.
But black women got counted twice, so they were still able to count as women and as black. And so there was incentive, particularly for federal and private institutions, to prioritize hiring them for jobs. So in that way, white women and black women were able to benefit materially and institutionally from this new racial calculus that's taking place, right?
At the expense of whom?
At the expense of black men.
Because there's only so many jobs to go around. Who do you take the jobs from? So white women got black men's jobs.
And black women got to develop a new behavior, particularly in the late 70s, but it really came out in the 80s, of not needing a man, right? And you heard them say it like a mantra. You don't need no man, and niggas ain't shit. Those two mantras went hand in hand. And they were both predicated not only on the same idea of black male inferiority, they were also linked to the institutional benefits of being able to navigate society without having to negotiate with men, which is what any other group of women have to do within their own racial strata.
Right.
Yet black women were liberated from having to negotiate with their men, because when you talk about a relatively poor community, it really doesn't take much to incentivize any one group to see itself as better. I mean, that takes like a generation.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, basically welfare, Section 8, child support, corporate jobs, basically preferential education. Because really, if a woman really wants to go to school, all she has to do is have a baby. She'll get grants, she'll get loans, she'll get scholarships, get all kinds of, just so she can go to school. So if she has nothing else going on, at the very least, she can have a baby and get all those benefits. While the father will most likely be hounded for child support and probably get put in jail.
Absolutely. And this is it, man. Oh my goodness. Sometimes I gotta breathe it. I gotta breathe it out. I gotta breathe it out. It's amazing to me how impactful that shift was. In terms of, and this is something that happened within my lifetime. Shout out, I'm gonna shout out, well, BGS has done this in his work for the last 5 years. Valdez has had a couple of key videos where he's talked about the generational differences between Black boomers, Black Generation X, Black millennials. But the one that comes out, most in my mind, listen to the discussion between Kevin Samuels and Minister Japp when he talks about dating in the 90s. And don't let the title fool you. It's not limited to dating. But one of the things that Kevin actually begins to do is he begins to talk about the kind of worldview shift
Mm-hmm.
that happens in the 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s. Well, not even early, in the 2000s. Across a 30-year span, he talks about the attitudinal shifts
Mm-hmm.
among Black women and Black men. And he does an excellent job of it because, I grew up in the same time period, but he's a little older. So even through the 1990s, I spent much of the 1990s as a student, but Kevin spent it more as an adult, navigating marriages and different things of that nature, as well as BGS. So they're connecting the data to their own personal experiences, and in that particular discussion, it's an excellent breakdown on what some of the major shifts was, and they happened in such short order.
Mm-hmm.
When you grow, and this is something I talked to my father about, because I remember I was explaining the 1970s to him from a Black masculinist standpoint. And I'll break that down a little bit in a moment. But, he had not really heard the 70s explained in that way. And he said, that's interesting you're saying this to me. He said, because we experienced it. But, when you're experiencing history,
Right.
you don't have the benefit of, hindsight.
Right.
And I want to highlight what we're going through now with COVID. My students, I'm trying to tell them, you're living history. You're not going to understand this for another 20, 30 years. But it's the same kind of thing that's happened in past generations from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. There were so many shifts that took place that if you grew up in it, it's hard to really kind of explain it and understand it until somebody who's capable does it for you and gives you some perspective. And then you can fill in the gaps with your own experiences. So listen to that discussion if you haven't had a chance to. And it really highlights how these shifts impacted the Black community.
Yeah, we basically, crack just dropped a nuclear bomb in the middle of the Black community, and basically just started destroying the family structure because it actually changed the way women dealt with themselves socially, but also sexually, and also even on the job. They actually literally cut asunder the whole Black family.
Well, and I got to shout out Kev again in terms of that, because one of the things he pointed out was the specific use of corporate tactics when it came to dating and mating. And that was really interesting because he highlighted how, Black women who were recently being welcomed into the corporate world began using really kind of corporate radar or corporate culture in how they navigated relationships. One of the hilarious examples he gave was the way they did this when it came to, rooting out men that they might marry. He said the way, in the mid 1990s, the way they went about that was you would get an interview. It wasn't a date, it was an interview. And it had a very corporate feel to it. And I remember that myself, but I didn't, again, I'm going through that time period as a young man experiencing it. So it didn't dawn on me, what the major generational shifts were and how they were happening. It didn't dawn on me while it was occurring, but it was very much tied to this kind of culture that they had been given access to due to affirmative action policy, and the ways in which they incorporated that into how they dealt with their own men.
The thing is that it started like in the mid 80s, and with I think William Julius Wilson, he was doing that work about marriageable, what a marriageable Black man was, and a qualification that he had, and then I know you saw the dating shows where that Black women were single because they couldn't find parallel mates that were on that. That's where they're on that level came from in the mid 80s, right? And then that's where it started, and it's kind of ballooned ever since, from into the 90s, into the 2000s, and continuing where what they call assortative mating. Whereas before that, it didn't matter if Mama had a master's degree and Daddy was a plumber or a mechanic. Okay, she's educated. He goes out and makes money. They bring the two families together, the two halves together, and they make a family. Now, Black men had to qualify at that level. Okay. That's where I need a guy on my level. I need a guy that's educated. I need a guy that's corporate. I need a guy that has a certain kind of status. whereas
Mm-hmm.
before it didn't matter before. And that
Well,
was
and
that was the first generation, I think, Generation X, where that was actually more important.
right, and that's the key, right? The transition from Boomers to Generation X. That's
Mm-hmm.
where you saw that, but it was also I need a man who has the requisite degrees that I have,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
education, which again had only in the late 70s really opened up to Black women in a different way.
Right.
Even though in terms of the data, black men have never gotten more degrees than Black women in a given year in American history.
Right.
But despite that, it opened up in a whole new way in the 70s and 80s for Black women. So this arbitrary idea that a man is not good enough unless he has the same level degrees I have became a huge split, because the irony there is you had blue collar brothers that might have been making more money even in the 80s than educated Black women without the school loan debt, and yet they were still not good enough. So the model for what the appropriate man was often based on a white corporate model. It was based on the white men they associated with.
In a section, feminism turned Black women into white women.
Damn. Let's go.
literally, they the same kind of speak. And then you get, the color purple, and you get all these the Terry McMillan, and what kind of man you should have, the Waiting to Excel crowd, because that was popular during then. They said exactly the same thing. How do you qualify a man? What should he have?
Again, which is why it's so important to me when Oprah Winfrey says she's going to reintroduce the color purple for a new generation.
Right.
I know what it did to my generation, what it can, what it contributed to. Again, I mean, Oprah and her channel or her show at that time was the kind of spigot for what was a very elite kind of Black feminist conversation in university hallways and classes, and that mainstreamed a lot of that kind of Black feminist speech, and it helped to contribute to this culture that we're talking about. But I also think about it in terms of how Black men have literally survived or died. Again, earlier today when I showed the video of the 6 generations of Black women, right? Daughter to mother, and so on and so forth. I thought it poignant because this is really not about that particular family. It's not. I just thought the optics of that video was powerful to see 6 generations of Black women in a family gathering of some sort, celebrating the longevity of their family. And I couldn't help but ask the question, how many of those women have men? Or do the men, are the men even still alive? How many stories have we heard about, Big Mama is the center of the family, but when you talk about Granddad, he died 30, 40 years ago.
I have never met my grandfather. My grandfather I've never met. My maternal grandfather, I've never met him.
But then we also don't reflect on what that means.
And in fact, it gets to the point that I barely know. My mother has barely talked about her father.
See, this go ahead.
No, I was going to say this is typical. How many Black men can actually trace their paternal line all the way back more than 1 or 2 generations? The names are like erased.
Real quick, 413 watching. Please like, share, subscribe. I want to get my subscribers over 10,000 soon if I can, so please help out with that endeavor. Share the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. I usually go on once a week, but sometimes some other things will hit and I might do a surprise pop in, or there'll be some pre-recorded videos. So please support the channel, and if you can't do so in any other way, please make sure you at least subscribe. But this is also reminiscent of something that I talk about in one of my written works. I talk about what I call a gynopotestal family, and basically what that refers to is we've reached an era where you can literally meet a woman, right, and she has a daughter, and she lives either with or near her mother and her mother's mother. So you can have 4 generations of women, right, who don't have any men in their families,
right,
from grandmother down.
Yes.
There are no men to be found, whether they're no longer alive or whether they have been, whether there's been a divorce or they were never married or never wanted to necessarily be fathers. I mean, we talk about the reproductive process outside of the actual physical act of sex. Men don't have very much protection beyond that. Which is why if financial abortion is one of the options on the black male political agenda, because at the end of the day, your seed, once it leaves your body, you are wholly at the mercy of whatever decision a woman makes.
Yeah. And the thing is that if you read E. Franklin Fraser's book, the Negro Family of the United States, you find out far too many times the man doesn't just leave; he's pushed out.
He's pushed out.
Right. After that kids get to a certain age, he's no longer needed. The women actually push him out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
He served his purpose.
But then too, if you can use the state as a proxy force,
right,
to implement your particular vision, to implement your attempt to control, you can push fathers out using the family court, using the police. Definitely by the time we get the Duluth model, you can even use false accusations of abuse or sexual assault or rape. And all of these become mechanisms that black men cannot use, but can only really be subject to. And so when you begin to add them up, what we see is the elimination of the black male from the family. Again, I talked about this last week, and the ways in which it impacts the black family. So this gynopotestal structure where you have, pockets of, and I met a woman a few years ago on a dating app, and we went and had breakfast, and I'm talking to her, and sure enough, she's got a daughter. She lives across the street. No, her mother lived with her. Her grandmother lived around the corner from her, right? So so there was like 4 generations of women, and although they didn't live under the same roof, there was a web, there was a connection of them in a short area, sort of small space in town. And so what I was noticing, I was like, wow, well, where are the men? Oh, well, I never married my husband. It was, we just got pregnant and he didn't want to be a father. Well, what happened with your mother? Oh, well, I never really knew my father. Okay, well, where's your grandfather? Well, he died 40 years ago. And it's this interesting kind of thing. So again, when I see that video of the 6 generations of women, for me, it doesn't come across as a celebration of a family or even of the black family. For me, it comes across as a statement about the absence and exclusion and expulsion in many instances of black men from the family.
It kind of reminds me of a beehive after the male drones have seeded the queen. Guess happens, they get pushed out of the hive.
And you gonna have me you gonna have me pulling out a drink tonight, man. Why you said it like that?
I mean, seriously, I think I was going to write a short story called "Drones" about how black boys are used as material to seed, and that was common in the South. Okay, a woman would get a man, and she would have, the requisite number of children, 8, 9, 10 children. After the oldest boy got old enough to take his place, the man got pushed out of the family. She didn't need him anymore.
But this is why I proposed black masculinism, and essentially the formal definition of it is that it centers black males across age, class, and sexuality, seeks to frame the actual state of black male life in measurable terms. Advocating for black male studies, we endeavor to empirically contextualize the major pillars that indicate black males' quality of life, from carceral treatment to criminal and civil sentencing, leading causes of death, health, employment, income, wealth status, education, violence, intimate partner violence and homicide, rape, housing, homelessness, types of labor, political approaches, wealth, family court impact, fatherhood, forms of protest, marriage, and the history of institutionally based treatment are just beginning points for analysis. I call for black masculinism to highlight black males' lives beyond society's assumptions, often rooted in stereotype and based on shorthand information, slanderous media representations, and even personal grudges. The areas of analysis for black masculinism are anti-black misandry, white supremacy, black gynarchy, the dual economy, socioeconomic underdevelopment, and so forth. But essentially what it is a multidisciplinary approach at analyzing black male life and advocating for a more realistic and measurable idea of what black male life is. So moving beyond stereotype, moving beyond narrative, people's personal narratives, because people tell you story. about one black man that did something to him that you can't verify, but that somehow justifies how
Right.
black men as a group are perceived. So black masculinism is both a political movement as well as a means of analysis for making sense of black male life on measurable, empirically based terms. And so that's one of the reasons that we kind of go through the news articles that, BGS and I went through earlier, and even some of the data in regard to boys. We're trying to look at black male life beyond the convenient and slanderous narrative of what society has given us, and look at what tells us about black male life beyond that. And one of the things that, again, going back to Athena Matua, when she identified Spook Freeman, appreciate that support. When she identified black male privilege, these were kind of the examples she referred to. I added a little bit based on some of the things I've heard people say, right? Hold on. Uh-oh. It's always kind of happens. I'm getting better at managing this, but still catches me off guard sometimes. All right. So in terms of black male privilege, the idea here pushed forth by Matua as well as other black feminists that I've run across over the years is that black men were privileged because in terms of college education and professional sports, they have access that nobody does. And because they can become millionaires in sports, in music, in dance, some type of entertainment based field, because they have opportunity. Now, obviously not in terms of music and dance, because women have access to that too, but because sports is so overwhelmingly beneficial to males and not females, that it highlights a privilege. Any thoughts on that, BGS?
The one thing that I'm looking at on that chart, I don't see how that's a privilege, is death.
Well, I see the privilege is, and this is the argument made by feminists, that death, in the sense that they are recognized in their deaths as of that. And this has actually been a statement that I have seen written as well as spoken by established scholars, that because black men are recognized in death disproportionately, that is a form of privilege. Now, you tell me if any of that recognition has diminished the rates of death for black men.
It has not.
And often when we talk about it, it's not because black men are just, loved to any greater degree. It's because we often are able to, especially in the last, if we go back to Rodney King, right? One of the major differences when it comes to black male death is that it's caught on camera so easily. And it's caught on camera so easily because it's so prevalent.
It's so prevalent, yes.
That's the basis of it. But it's argued that it's a form of privilege.
So how do black men benefit from that privilege? I don't understand.
Well, and that's the question that one could ask about any of them, right? Because if you go to the sports one, look, you already know probably better than I do, because I'm not a sports aficionado. It's only been in recent decades that you've seen men getting $20 million, $30 million deals as athletes. I mean, the overwhelming majority of professional athletes they may make a six-figure income. They have a shelf life of 3 to 5 years on average. And they may make six figures, and I mean even in the lower 100s.
Yes.
And then be out.
Right? The small percentage that actually get there.
The small percentage they get. And when you really begin to think about black boys who actually start playing sports in elementary school, especially football, basketball, but even boxing, when you look at how long they've been doing this, the percentage of them that even make it to the pros is a fraction of 1%. But when you factor in that they have a shelf life of 3 to 5 years and may make six figures during that time period and then be completely out of the game
and broke, yeah.
And we're not even talking about how they're exploited in college, where they don't, they're not making an income. So, but to have that listed as a privilege, particularly, and these are the boys that are sitting in my class, man, and I'm telling you, many of them can barely read. Many of them don't make it through their 4 years, whether it's due to injury, whether it's due to dropping out, whether it's due to low academic performance. They end up right back at home where they came from far too often. Right. But the fact that it's even being framed as a privilege. Right. And I've had students that will take classes,
Mm-hmm.
or go to lectures, by these feminists, and come back with this kind of mentality. And I've talked about this even with a dear student of mine who was almost like a daughter to me. She came back from a lecture and she was excited about black male privilege. And at this lecture, this took place at Fresno State, the two pieces of information used to justify the existence of black male privilege was a picture of Snoop Dogg with a chain around a woman's neck, and the idea that black men eat the big piece of chicken at dinner. This is by a tenured professor who's giving a lecture about black male privilege. Though, well, there was three pieces of evidence. She said the other evidence was that black men didn't suffer from hair discrimination. I've since, written a piece on my blog dismantling that because it's ridiculous and it's not true. Black men have always suffered from hair discrimination, and to greater degrees than black women, believe it or not, because we have beards.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about, jobs, that might require you be clean shaven. And many black men can testify to the impact of being clean shaven without the proper means to do that. So the kind of scarification of the face, so on and so forth. So black men have always suffered from hair discrimination, but those were her three pieces of evidence: hair discrimination, Snoop Dogg having a chain around a woman's neck, and eating the big piece of chicken.
So why don't we just suppose the perceived black male privilege against the black female privilege, actually list by list, and see which one is greater? Since we're going to do this,
we can do that. But I just want to put,
the big piece of chicken.
I want to put it on there.
It was actually explained to me by my grandmother about why one, they feed the men first, and why they get them the greater amount of food
at a certain time period. Right, but go ahead, please explain.
In other words, they had to keep the black male alive and well for as long as possible because they're doing very heavy work for like 12, 13 hours a day. And if he didn't survive, the whole family was in trouble. So you had to feed him first. You had to feed him well so you could actually go out and provide for the rest of the family. So that's where the tradition comes from. Even today, who does the most physical work in the black family? Is the female or the male?
I'm not sure, man. We're so privileged.
We're so privileged.
I don't know. You tell me.
So if they're lucky enough to have a black male in the family, the reason that they get the most food, the reason that they get the big piece of chicken, is so they can actually do more work. It's not a privilege. Is it a privilege to work yourself to death for a family?
And now you're adding in the whole other component to it, that I wanted to bring up. And my boy M. Prince says the big piece of chicken also gives you heart disease.
That is very true. It's like calling your plow horse, where you have to feed a great amount of food, more food than you can eat, saying that the horse is privileged.
That the horse is privileged, right? You're right. Shout out to Adam for the support. Shout out to Lance. Appreciate that. Shout out to Ray. Appreciate the support. Let's see. And I think I also may have missed a few Cash Apps. Nicole, appreciate the support. Thank you. And Cedric, thanks for the PayPal. But, against this male privilege, I just listed a few basic areas of where young black men experience what we could call ignored vulnerability. Right? They're the areas that they're vulnerable. Vernon, appreciate the support. Areas where they're vulnerable and yet we don't pay any attention to it. Officer Faulkner done weighed in. The big piece of chicken. About the big piece of respect and dignity. Yeah. And I'm joking, but I'm not, because when the big piece of chicken was brought up, it's brought up with a very kind of factual tone, a very kind of serious take. And again, going back to my student, when I asked her, well, if I asked you to prove, white male privilege, how would you prove it? She said, I would look at home ownership rates. I would look at income. I would look at inherited wealth. I would look at, and she just rattled off 10 different categories, just right off the head. And I said, okay, you take those very same 10 categories and tell me where black men and women fit on each one of them. She looked at me
Mm-hmm.
She looked down at the ground.
Mm-hmm.
She looked to the side, what people do when they're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And then she went, "Oh." I said, "So you sat in the lecture and listened to the big piece of chicken argument, but you can give me right off the head 10 different methods you would use to assess privilege when it comes to white men.
Mm-hmm.
None of that comes to mind when it comes to black men." And the reason it didn't come to mind, and this is no disrespect to her, but the reason it didn't come to mind is because it was to be taken as an assumption that black males and white males are the same. Therefore, in terms of flat gender, right? As far as manhood is concerned, whatever white men benefit from, all men benefit from. And so it didn't dawn on her. And this thing, that was a lecture that was primary. I might have been one of two, if not three, black males in the room. There might have been over 200 people there, all black women for the most part, and they gave this woman a standing ovation. Right? It was well received because denigrating black men without evidence is par for the course. It's accepted.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only rooted in a misandry toward black men, but it's also rooted in an assumption that black men and white men are the same. Men are men.
Yeah.
Right. But
which is something Sojourner Truth said back in the 1850s, that black men and white men are the same. If you give black men privilege, any kind of leg up, they're going to be the same people.
Right, they're going to be the same people, even though the evidence doesn't support that at all. But just, you can see here the areas of ignored vulnerability that I pointed to. And basically, this was supposed to be a note to myself, but Michi X recently did a show where she talked about a 16-year-old black boy that was sexually assaulted and raped. And I didn't get a chance to include that in my current events intro. So you can check out, I want to say it's one of the last 3 shows she did, but I think she did it with Dr. Shawnee, and she kind of talked about that. So if you haven't gotten a chance to hear that, you can go check it out. But I was just going to cite that as an example. But when it comes to sexual assault and rape of black boys, there's little discussion on that. When it comes to, and even, parental abuse, as you can see down here, often across race, it's mostly extended to children by women, in higher numbers, but there's no discussion on it. We just talked about education and really looked at some of the data that, is not really mainstream by any measure. We talked earlier about, how juveniles are treated, right? How they're hyper punished, expelled from schools and put into institutions. We obviously saw an example of police treatment when we looked at the young man who was merely trying to keep his arms warm and was tackled and hospitalized. We can talk about foster youth, particularly black boys, as the least adopted, the least supported, least sought after, and the most criminalized. And the rates of foster children, of foster boys that are incarcerated and hypercriminalized in that respect are fairly high. And I have it in another paper, but I didn't have time to kind of pull it in for today. So I might do a future show on that if anybody's interested. And of course, in terms of employment, I mean, the rates of young black male unemployment in certain cities is extremely high, well over 50%.
Yeah.
And yet nobody talks about that. Right. So these are just a few, and this is just random. These are just a few things that I typed out in terms of areas where black male vulnerability is ignored. But we can have a conversation about
the big piece of chicken,
the big damn piece of chicken. Now, I'm sorry. Now, I did interrupt you because you were saying you were thinking about measuring black male privilege against black female privilege. Did you want to continue that thought?
No, I was just thinking nobody ever talks about black female privilege, about the advantages that black females have as opposed to black males. The advantages and disadvantages. Because they never talk about black female privilege. It's never a discussion. And they even talk about white female privilege, but black female privilege is never discussed because it's assumed that they don't have it.
Right.
That they're doubly oppressed by black males and by the white establishment.
Right. And the more you go into the data, the more you find that to be questionable. So again, shout out to Dr. Tommy Curry. If you haven't read his book, The Man Not, please do so. It'll definitely give you the paradigm that you need to best, kind of assess what's been going on and kind of make sense of that. But any closing thoughts before we close out, brother?
This I'm just wondering, man, how this oppression against black males have been going on for 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
And civil rights was supposed to actually address that. I'm just wondering how long will people just ignore the problem that just keeps festering and festering and festering.
You know,
Even we educate our females, but the thing is, the problem never gets better.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious. And in fact, when you try to bring it up, you actually get pushback that it can't be this bad,
Mm-hmm.
that this can't exist. That no, you can't have a privileged group of men of males with these kind of stats. That means they're defective because they have all these advantages that black women don't. But yet, what do they do with it?
Mm-hmm. And if you begin to actually point out the advantages they don't have, and you do any type of comparative analysis with black women or girls, it's immediately, conceptualized as, you know, um, something that black males are doing out of hatred for black women.
Yeah.
That's the immediate framework that it's put into. But the problem with that is it doesn't allow us to really look at the very real issues that we're facing. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the comparative analysis between black women and girls that I do and black men and boys is not to denigrate girls. It's actually to highlight how much race does not explain our experiences well enough. Because when you begin to really delve into the gender dynamic, you find that, again, and I've said this repeatedly, black men and boys live a completely
They
different
do.
quality of life. Shout out to Stone 8419. Appreciate the support. Um, and again, make sure you put your Cash App in the comments at least one more time for me, BGS. It wouldn't let me copy it. I'm in StreamYard, but anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and I appreciate you coming in today. Like I said, we're going to hook up next week, and we're actually going to talk about black male archetypes. If that's
Mm-hmm.
something you're interested in, or you want to make any
Yeah.
contribution to that preemptively, you can go ahead and send me an email. You can reach me very easily through my website, THasan-Johnson.com. Contact me through there. You can send any ideas you wish. I will definitely give you credit and point out if I think it fits where I'm going with it. Where that is.
The thing is that in this modern society, all the things that we're talking about are preventable.
Mm-hmm.
They're all preventable, easily
Mm-hmm.
preventable.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that either nobody's people will actually want this to continue, or nobody cares. I don't know which it is, but
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff is preventable, easily preventable.
Well, and the thing about it is, and this is why the promotion demotion thesis is so key.
Mm-hmm.
If you extended to males the same benefits you extended to females from the 1980s forward, this would be a radically different conversation right now.
Mm-hmm.
If they, you know what I mean, if they were extended on equal grounds, it would be a very different conversation. But it's the degree to which they were not extended on equal grounds, and boys and men suffered disproportionately. So again, while they got college access, we got the war on drugs.
Well, the thing is, if you just left the black males alone, okay, leave them to their own devices. Stop trying to hold them back. Stop trying to target them. Stop trying to target them in schools, on the street, by police. Just let them be. You will see an improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Not even helping them, just treating them equally.
Mm-hmm.
Without the oppression by holding them back, by targeting them.
Mm-hmm.
They would
Absolutely.
improve just by doing that, without the large scale programs to help them. If you just leave them alone,
Mm-hmm.
just let them be regular people,
Mm-hmm.
instead of
Absolutely.
this monster that they've been portrayed to be, which is, instead of trying to keep your foot on the neck and keep them as underclass that they've been for the last 300 years. How much better would black boys and black men be if you just treat them regularly, not give them help, but just treat them regularly?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm curious.
Absolutely. And that would be something that I would have loved to see, and I still would love to see. And this is one of the reasons we do the black male political agenda, because I want black men to be able to articulate this on their own grounds, on their own terms.
Yeah, black women get benign neglect, and we get black men get active oppression.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks again, brother, for being on the show. Y'all know how I like to close out. I'm
Where's
here to tell. Oh,
sir?
go ahead.
Where's the
Huh?
T-shirt, sir?
Um, yeah, I need some help with the t-shirts. I made some designs and they were horrible. So if any of you out there can help with that, I'd greatly appreciate it. I was like, I ain't even trying to put these out there for brothers. They're gonna look at me crazy. But anyway, if you can extend some help on t-shirt design, I definitely appreciate that support. But like I said, y'all know how I close out. Brothers, we are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man children, sperm donors, child support well springs, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, brainless henchmen, valueless assassins, pro bono mercenaries, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We are thinkers, innovators, inventors, leaders, fathers, warriors, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting other people's narcissistic, selfish, and unrealistic needs. You define your worth. Peace. Mm, hold on. Dang it. This thing is stuck. Don't let me close out.